Hello. This is Mark Powell with the Powell Not Found podcast. Welcome to episode 76. Episode 76 is going to be a little bit more impromptu than our probably regular episodes, but I wanted to jump on mic tonight because I just watched a documentary on Netflix that kind of hit close to home, and because it was about the Montreal Expos, and the Montreal Expos, weirdly, was a bigger part of my childhood than I think anyone ever expected, just because I got the opportunity as a kid to see them before they left for Washington. I had heard this documentary was coming out on Netflix. The documentary is called Killed the Montreal Expos, which is directed by Jean-Francois Poisson. I hope that I'm not butchering that. And the reason I felt like I needed to jump on mic tonight was because the documentary kind of hit me in the feels, as they say. It made me feel sad, made me feel angry, made me remember things that had been buried in the back of my brain for a long time, made me look at that stadium for the first time in, gosh, it has to be more than 25, 23 years at this point. And I just wanted to talk about a few of my takeaways from watching this documentary. Just to give you a little context of where I'm coming from. I hope this is okay. When I was younger, my dad and I used to go to Montreal because we lived close in New Hampshire. We used to go across the border. This is before September 11th and stuff, and before the crackdown on the border and needing your passport. And it was only a 6-hour drive. And it's one of my favorite memories, going to that stadium and seeing baseball players up close as a kid. I still remember seeing these Expos games. It would be like $6 Canadian, or essentially the exchange rate was crazy. So we were getting like seats for like $2. And we could sit up close, which was not something that was very common back then. Now I feel like SeatGeek and all these different ticketing agencies give people the opportunity to sit up close. And I don't know whether it was just the prices or the money or the opportunity, but it seemed like the opportunity to do that wasn't very frequent as a kid. We lived close to Fenway, about 45 minutes from Fenway Park. And even at the time, even when the Red Sox were kind of gearing up and they would get, and they were okay. Getting into Fenway was a little bit tough, right? Because it was a small ballpark, still continues to be a small ballpark. And when they really got good, it started to get a little bit unattainable, right? And that was the nice thing about Montreal, is because you could take a trip, stay in a hotel, get front row seats for a nickel, and see some of your favorite players and players that I remember as a kid, like Jose Vidro or Vladimir Guerrero, up close. I remember even seeing Jim Thome. He was on the Phillies at that point, on first base, and I kid you not, the stadium was so quiet in Montreal that I feel like you could hear his conversation. You couldn't probably, but the experience of going to Olympic Park in Montreal resonates with me today, just because of, one, how empty it was when I was going. And remember, this is around like probably 1998, 1999, 2000 time. I think the last time we went was post 2001. So it was then the end of that era, and the era that they talk about in this film, and how loud it could get so quickly, because some of the chair banging that would happen on those yellow seats that they show you in this documentary. But so it sticks with me a lot. And there isn't really a day that goes by that I lament what happened to this team. And that's the subject of this documentary. This documentary, again, directed by Jean-Francois Poisson, puts the Expos in a spotlight that, let's just say, hasn't been very frequent for this lost franchise. Baseball has had a lot of franchises that have come and gone. They talk about it in the beginning of this documentary about how there are still people that lament the fact that the Brooklyn Dodgers left New York. I know that it was very, very common for people in Long Island to this is a generation ago, but to see people that sitting in Shea Stadium and rooting for the Dodgers when the Dodgers came to town, because that's how much franchises stick with you. And when they're taken away from you, the fandom is hard to break. And that's one of the things that this documentary introduced to me, which was fascinating. This lineage of a team that lasted from 1969 to 2004. So what is that? 35 years. And still, people are still feeling the emptiness and the void that is left behind when a team moves away. So this isn't new to baseball, but it's nice to see them showing us, kind of showcasing that this happened to Montreal and that baseball runs deep in their veins. When I first put this documentary on, I immediately thought, and immediately, let me cut to here the trailer here. When I immediately saw this trailer for the first time, I thought in my head that this was a play, kind of cynically, but this was a play to nudge and remind everybody that baseball used to be a big thing in Montreal. And they talk about how popular Montreal was and how amazing the baseball culture was there, and that there's been this myth that the 1994 season and the strike really kind of ruined the Expos. And this documentary kind of goes through not only just a history of the team and how the team kind of came to be and the popularity, how the 1994 strike contributed to maybe the downfall of a team and the fire sale of a team. And they go through the lineage of owners that this team had, and kind of they say in the very beginning of the documentary, they let the audience decide, well, who really was to blame for the collapse of this franchise. A lot of eye-opening things, right, that happened to me personally when watching this. One, immediately, like I said before, thought it was about trying to remind everybody that, hey, Montreal is still a viable city to move baseball to. And we are here on the edge of expansion, and we're also here on the edge of a strike. But there's been a lot of talk about moving baseball into new cities. Salt Lake, Vancouver, Nashville have all been floated around. Vegas, obviously, they're getting the A's. Sacramento, there's been new talk about baseball is eventually going to expand to 32 teams. It seems like a given. I thought immediately that this is a commercial just to get baseball in Montreal. You find out very soon that this is not a commercial for how well baseball works in Montreal. If anything, it works in the exact opposite way. It shows you how difficult it was maintaining a team in Montreal. They say over and over and over again about how it was a losing venture, it was losing money, and seemingly at the height of their popularity. Of course, different time, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s is financially going to be a different landscape than something today. So, but it doesn't necessarily scream like, we're ready for another baseball team. And in fact, it kind of pushes you in the opposite direction, which was antithetical to what I initially thought this movie was going to be about. They also talk about the fandom in a very, very interesting way. It's almost Wrexham-like. If you've ever watched the TV show Welcome to Wrexham, that's the Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney joint that they did on Hulu. They use some of the mega fans in order to tell the story of the team, to show you just how passionate people are about seeing the Expos. And I thought that was kind of a cool a cool way to tell the story. Is that it's not just told from the perspective of people in suits. It's told by the people who love this team. Even they moved out in 2004, so you're even talking about 21 years after they've left the city, that there are still people lamenting the fact. Even players themselves. Pedro Martinez stars in this film. Felipe Alou stars in this film. Larry Walker, who I just does not resonate with me as an Expo. I've always, because I was like 6 or something, 7 by the time he was traded or let go from the Expos, star in this film and talk about how much they miss baseball in that area. So I thought that was kind of a cool little art of storytelling. From a visual perspective too, I think it's really cool looking. They use a lot of old clips that I feel like just were lost to time, and but they use a mixture of illustrative elements and stuff to kind of tell the story that's really nice. The one negative I will say about this documentary is that initially, because you forget that Montreal's in Quebec, and people are speaking French, so they dub a lot of English over French speakers in order to kind of keep the pace of the documentary going. They don't necessarily take like a little pause to show you they're speaking French and then dub. Very interestingly enough, too, this documentary also dubs English over English speakers, which is really bizarre. I don't know if it's just to summarize what they're saying, but that is a choice I've never seen in a documentary. I mean, I know David Sampson speaks English in real life. I don't know why they dubbed over David Sampson speaking English, if not to maybe just summarize the point of what that sound and tape was. But anyway, it's interesting. If you watch the documentary, you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, too, another big takeaway that I had was that it made me realize just like that the team's history that they convey is a little bit more interesting than the point of the movie, which is maybe not articulated very, very well. What I mean by that is that the blame game, the whole premise of this film of Who Killed the Montreal Expos, is a movie searching for one point. I believe David Sampson, who was the vice president of the Expos, famously the president of the Florida Marlins and a podcaster now, says in the very, very end that everybody's looking to kind of find that point where something goes wrong and something that caused the failure. But like, I think he insinuates that it's a collection of everybody's kind of actions that kind of lead to the failure of this franchise. And that whole premise of who did what and who was to blame and who was blaming each other, it creates a really good drama, but it's almost not really interesting in the end because we know it dies, right? And we know they end up becoming the Nationals and stuff like that. It reminds it's just very typical. It's a very typical story that's being told, that it's like collectively the actions over 35 years of different people in different times led to the end result of the franchise not being sustainable. And that was one of the things where it's like, well, yeah, when David Sampson makes that point at the very end, and let me be clear, David Sampson is like the star of this documentary. He is the most animated in defending his point and also trying to articulate this case. I think he far and away charismatically outshines a lot of other talking heads in this documentary. But I think he's right in when he's saying that like collectively this was heading towards a natural conclusion in 2004, that it wasn't sustainable, which is why I said earlier in the show that like it's not a commercial for, hey, let's bring baseball back. If anything, it says the exact opposite, saying that this is maybe a venture that they had 36 years to succeed. What struck me also too is that some of the themes in the documentary resonate today. And what do I mean by that? Well, in 1994, a lot of the ownerships were talking about the sustainability of baseball in terms of players' contracts and salaries and how much money they have to invest in this team and how much money is sustainable to keep a team running, right? And in 1994, I think they quit with 115, 114 games, and that was the season where Montreal, I think, was up like 6 games or 7 games up on the Atlanta Braves. And the Braves, if you don't know, if you're not privy to it, the Braves in the early 90s were like what the Yankees were in the late 90s, right? Dominant. The Braves they had one World Series to their name in 1995, but they were always in it. So when Montreal says, hey, we were beating the Braves, we took 2 out of 3 in the Braves in this series, that meant something because the Braves were stacked. I mean, if any of you are old enough to remember, the TBS had the Braves on all the time. It was America's team. They were Smoltz, Maddox, Glavine. I mean, these teams were stacked. Even going into the late 90s. So if they beat them, that meant something. And so when play stopped in 1994 because of a strike, the World Series was canceled. And what struck me is that it resonates today, right? That was the first strike in Major League Baseball in 90 years since 1904, as said in the documentary. And here in 2027, we're looking at a work stoppage because of the introduction of a salary cap, which is exactly what they were trying to introduce in 1994. So it's funny how time is a flat circle sometimes. And we end up arguing and articulating the same things over and over and fighting about the same things over and over and over again years later. That was the first thing that kind of really struck me as like, wow, like we're going through the same thing over and over again. And for a lot of people, I think the myth perpetuated, and this is what this documentary debunks, is that the 1994 strike kind of killed the momentum and any kind of financial gains that the Montreal Expos would have made. Well, that is a little hard to believe. I mean, the Expos continued to be a franchise for the next 10 years. I remember going to the Expos games when in the end, and there wasn't a lot of people. I mean, the way the documentary kind of frames the love of baseball in Montreal, well, by the time I got there as a kid, I mean, it was empty. They would put the attendance on the wall, on the scoreboard or whatever. And I swear to God, there would be like 7 people in the stadium and they'd be like, we sold 3,000 tickets. And it's like, no, you didn't. Like it can't be, right? I can probably count the fans that are in the stadium at the time. I mean, it was so quiet. I felt like you could hear someone say going when someone tried to steal a base in Olympic Park. They talk also too about how unsuitable Olympic Park was and how there struggles to build a new stadium. And to me, it's ironic because they ended up moving to DC. They ended up playing in RFK for 3 years as the Washington Nationals when they finally relocated out of Montreal. And from all accounts, there are articles about that first season in RFK. And RFK, if you've ever been in that old stadium, and you can't go anymore, it's almost demolished at this point. It was rough to be in RFK. So it's kind of funny that they're like, oh, Olympic Stadium was a dump. And it's like, you didn't move to much better. Albeit they did build a new stadium in Washington, D.C. And for the last 20 years, now the Nationals won World Series under their belt. That seemed to play out as a successful move. Whether baseball will ever come back to Montreal, my God, I would love to see baseball come back to Montreal. I'd be, like they say, Pedro Martinez says he'd be the first fan. I feel like I'd be the second fan in there trying to look at baseball, because so much of going to those games like instilled a love of the game going in there and the accessibility of getting in there. Granted, like, obviously my father was driving to Montreal. I wasn't helping him at that point, like 7 years old, right? But to get up there, but the fact that I was able to see baseball helped fuel that love of the game for me. And that's the other big takeaway that I was trying to kind of search for earlier in the show. So many times I talk about on the podcast that baseball has an accessibility problem, right? There's blackouts for in-market games. Now streaming giants are taking over broadcasts opening day, Apple TV, Roku. Didn't HBO have a game at one point? And the one thing that has differed from my growing up is that you could see a baseball game on a local channel, right? Whether it was Fox or if it was PIX when you were growing up or whatever. And seeing the teams in person and being able to afford that team helps people get into the game. And now with everything, with all these walls going up and with all these people trying to make people jump through hoops, it feels like sometimes the accessibility to baseball is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I don't know about you, but I mean, there's a reason I'm wearing this Expo hat right now. There's a reason there's an Expo jacket in my car. There's a reason that every single time I walk with my Expo hat on, somebody says, "Hey, I like the Montreal Expos too," right? It was because of the accessibility of going to those games, especially where I lived, right? Where you could drive up, you could spend a nickel and be in a front seat, right? So even though it didn't, and they talk about sometimes like them ripping them off of television was a bad decision. Yes, that's a bad decision to kill the fan base. If you take away their access, you're not going to have a lot of money being driven to the park. And I certainly saw the end result of that in person. But, that's what I'm just saying. I think the accessibility of being able to see the game helped me instill that love for this team that you so clearly see in this documentary that made me feel sad to know that the Expos were gone and may never come back. It made me excited the couple years ago when the Rays they were talking about relocating that team and half playing in Montreal, half playing in Tampa, and seeing if that worked. I hope they come back. Right? I hope that this documentary, just like how I've talked about 1,000 times before, Drive to Survive, was a wake up call to America in terms of like, get into F1. This is very, very interesting. Hopefully this documentary does the same thing in reminding everybody that there is a fervent fan base for the Montreal Expos that are waiting and chomping at the bit. And that potentially maybe 25 years later, now that people can watch baseball on MLB.TV, they can find, if they're out of market, they can kind of get bigger viewership than they ever could before. It's not as localized anymore. Maybe the Expos as a concept work a little bit better in the 21st century than it did or now than it did in the 20th century and the first 4 years of the 21st century. Maybe that's a better endeavor now, and hopefully maybe this documentary turns a couple heads and makes you think about how cool this franchise was. And might I say, one of the cooler designed logos you'll ever see in baseball, outside of the Milwaukee Brewers, who I think might have the best logo in baseball. But anyway, I just wanted to jump on Mike. I wanted to talk about that really, really quickly. This will be episode 76. Do with it what you will. But again, this is Who Killed the Montreal Expos on Netflix. It's a good movie. Go check it out. It's an hour and a half. And certainly as an Expos fan, it made me feel a little nostalgic, I guess is the word, for a team that I have not watched in over 2 decades, but I miss, and being, obviously we record outside of Washington, stuff like that. It's always nice to be nearby what the Expos were. And I always, whenever, just to wrap it up really quickly, but whenever I go to a Nats game, it's always nice to see that they represent the Expos in such a small way in the team store. It's either like a hat or some sort of jersey. It's very small, but that just connecting that lineage is such a subtle nod to we were the Expos. And that it's such a nice way to kind of represent that 36-year history for the team. Now that and to remind everybody who might not be familiar with how the Nationals now came to be after about 20 years, I always think that's like a nice little nod that the Nats do in their team store, as well as some of the retired numbers I believe are Expos as well. So anyway, that's Who Killed the Montreal Expos review. I just wanted to jump on Mike, and we'll see you next week. All right, bye.